In Dreamspace, mission to Marsylvania, you are a bounty hunter, and we are on Mars. Well, kind of, but not really, because this is a multiverse. In this world, different species has collided, and now you have a bounty to collect. In this video I will show you how to set up this game, but also how to play it. So this game is played out in kind of like a sci-fi fantasy world where you are having a mission that you need to complete. Now this game is looking quite awesome and quite great, but what I have here in front of me is just a prototype. So what you see now will not be the finished product, which means that some things might change until you get this on the table. But for now, let's just take a look at this cool little game. To start with, we need to place the big board in the center of the table for all players to easy reach. We then need to divide each of the different decks into their specific pile. The encounter cards for themselves, the equip cards, the ally cards, the spell cards, but also the curse cards. We then need to take the planetary hostile deck and put it face down on the top right empty spot. And then we put one face down on level 1, another one on level 2, and lastly one on level 3. We need to put a random Nuwa boss on the Nuwa boss spot, face down, but also one jungle boss on the jungle boss spot. And lastly, one final boss at the bottom of the board. Next we need to set up our player area, and we should start by taking a character. Now we can either choose these or take them at random. Up here you can see your character and your character's name. In this example here we have the chat blob. But we also need to take the miniature matching our character. This here is our character sheet, and here we can see all the information about our character. We can see their life, their attack value, defense, speed, meaning their movement, and their mana. At the start we should take life tokens matching the value on the life bar. Here we can see that this character has 4 life, so we should take 4 life tokens. But we also need to take mana matching the mana. In this case here, the shy blob has 4 manas, so we take 4 mana tokens. Next we need to take any starting equipment or starting spells. In this case here, this character starts with the laptop, meaning that we should now take the laptop and put it next to our player area. If we want to, we can also take a player aid card. This card will of course help us to keep a track on the game. Lastly, the player places their miniature on the dream ship starting point. So that was the setup of the game, and it actually goes quite fast even though it looks like a lot. But in this game we are on Marsylvania, and this here is a world that looks kind of like Mars as we know it. But here we have a new species called the Nuwas. This game is played during 5 different phases. But before we look at the actual gameplay, let's take a look at the character cards and the different cards so we know what they mean. So this here could be your character, the alligator. Now, as I said at the start of the video, this here is a 2-sided sheet, and you start on level 1. But as you progress through the country on Marsylvania, you will eventually level up to level 2 or even level 3, if you make it that far. Of course, on the other sides, the different stats of your character will change. But let's start by looking at the basic. Up here we can see a portrait of your character, but also the name. Down here we have a quote that your character is saying. We have a job title. We have the starting equipment. This could also be a spell, remember? And this was the card that we took during setup. In this case, the cheater's card. We have which planet this character come from. In this case, Lysarios. And then we have the briefcase. This here is quite important because this will determine how much equipment, spells, and allies your character can have. In this case here, the alligator can have 4 equipment, 2 spells, and 1 ally. Up here we have the special abilities for your character. Down here we have the life points of your character, the attack value, the defense value, the speed, meaning the movement value, and lastly the mana. Each character possesses special abilities that they can use during their turn. As the game goes on and you gain more level, you will get more abilities. Some of these abilities are activable, meaning that they will cost you something to activate them, while some of them are passive and will always remain active throughout the game. Let's look at these stats a little bit closer. The life points represents the character's life points, and these points can of course be lost in battle. But you can also regain them if you have special potions or other items that will let you regain life. The life points can never be more than what this stats says. And if you lose all of these points, well, your character is considered to be defeated. Then we have attack and defense. These will tell you how strong your character's attack and defense is. And lastly, speed. And this is the amount of movements that your characters can do. All of these three stats can be manipulated by using spells or other items. And lastly we have mana. Now mana is used to be able to cast spells or activate other abilities. These can of course also be emptied, and you can never have more than what your stat says. But if you have special cards or abilities or spells, you can refill them. You will show how much life or mana you have by using the tokens we took in during setup. Meaning that if you lose one life, well then you remove one token. But if you regain it, well then you regain a token. And the same thing goes for mana. So this map is divided into 3 different sectors. Level 1, 2 and 3. And once your character crosses one of these sectors, they will level up. Meaning that when you go from level 1 to level 2, you should flip your character card over to the level 2 side. Now you will have a new ability, plus your stats will have changed. Once you come down to level 3, you will now start to use the level 3 ability as well. So that was the character cards. It's not too confusing, right? It's quite easy. But we still have the rest of the cards left. Let's start by looking at the equipment cards. These here are of course equipments that you can equip to your character and enhance their stats. Up here we see a picture of the equipment and a name. Up here it says if it is a base equipment or an expansion. In this case it says B, so this is a base equipment. Down here we have a sub-type. And you cannot have 2 equipments with the same sub-type unless it says other. But if you, for example, would have had one that said staff, well, you could only have one of those because you can't have 2 staffs. But in this case it says other, so you could have more than just one. And at the bottom of the card you can see what this will have for effect. And you can only have as many equipments as your briefcase can hold. In this case 3. Now let's take a look at spells. Again we have a picture, we have a name of the spell, we have if it is a base or an expansion, but down here we also have a mana cost. Meaning how much mana you need to spend to be able to cast this spell. On the spells we also have a sub-type. This will say if it is an attack spell or if it is a buff spell, a heal spell, or lastly a utility spell. The attack spells are of course the only spells that can be used to make an attack. The buff spell will let your character, well, buff up, meaning that they use these spells to boost themselves during combat. Again, down here you can see what the spell will actually do. Next we have heal, which is kind of self-explanatory as it will let you heal. And lastly we have utility. Now these will tell you what they do at the bottom of the cards, and they all have special utilities. You can also get an ally to join you on your journey through this weird land. These allies will also get you extra bonuses in battle. And then we have encounters. These are, well, encounters that you can encounter during your journeys. These have different types. Some of them simply wants to fight you, while others are more as an event. Well, you draw them and something probably bad will happen, while others will be kind of like a test, where you need to roll a die to see if you can complete it. But of course, you will also have to fight this enemy. Lastly, we have the planetary hostility. Now, this planet does not like you. So from the start, you will have a hostility against you, which will be stated on this card. Eventually, once you come down to another level, you will also have this hostility against you. But the players that are still on level 1 and has not come down to level 2 yet, does only have the level 1 hostility against them. But once they eventually come down to level 2, they will also get this one. So now that we know what the cards means, it's time for us to look at the actual gameplay. The first thing you need to do in this game is to move, which means that the first phase is the movement phase. Now when you are going to move, you get to roll 2 die. And then you take whatever result you get on those die and you multiply it with your speed. Now if we start by looking at the die, we can see that there is a symbol in the middle. There are symbols on all sides of these die, but let's ignore them for now. And let's focus on the number in the top left corner instead. Here it says 1. There is also a 2. And lastly, a 3. Now, these are the numbers that we're supposed to use and add up with our speed. The giraffe in this case got 2 swords, which gave him a total of 2 on the swords. 2 plus the speed, 2, is a total of 4 movement points. Out on the map we can see different squares. These are the squares that you can move on, and you can move horizontal or vertical. If you move horizontal, 1 step will cost you 1 movement point. If you choose to move vertical instead, 1 step will cost you 2 movement points. This means that in this case the giraffe, which has 4 movement points remember, could choose to move 1, 2, 3, 4 steps and end up over here. Or use 2 steps down here and 2 steps down here and end up the last movement down here. But you can of course also choose to move first vertical and then horizontal if you would like to. And of course if you have the movement points to do that move. Plus you do not need to use all of your movement points. And that was the first phase of this game. Quite easy, right? 1 movement point to move horizontal per step, or 2 points per step if you want to move vertical. Which just makes sense, because you make more progress if you go down on the map than go sideways, which should cost you more. The second phase in this game is the square effect. Because once you have moved your character and ended up on a square, you will see that there is an effect that will trigger now in phase number 2. These effects can all be positive or negative to you, all depending on what the text says. Here for example, you get to pull out 2 equipped cards and draw one of them. But they can also be negative. To help you get an easy overview of the different squares and what there might happen, you can look at these symbols. The ones with the warning means that this is probably a dangerous place to be. The ones with the question mark means that this is a mysterious positive effect. And the ones with the buildings also means that this is probably a positive effect. Phase number 3 happens if you reach another square where there already is another Dreamspacer. Now you have some choices. You can choose to steal from them, meaning that now you could choose to roll some die. And if you manage to roll 3 swords, you get to take one of the other player's cards. But you cannot take the starting card, because that one cannot be stolen. Other than that card, feel free to take whatever you want from your opponent. But if you do not manage to get 3 swords and instead get skulls, you will lose mana per skull you roll. And if you don't have any mana points left, you will instead lose 1 life. But you could also instead choose to simply trade. Meaning that now you ask your opponent if they want to trade a card with you. And if they want to, well, then you trade. If they don't want to, they simply say no. The next phase would be to draw an encounter card. And which level you draw depends on which level you're at out on the board. If you're on level 1, you draw from 1. If you're on 2, well then you draw from level 2. But if you are all the way down on level 3, well then you draw an encounter from level 3. Now what happens next of course depends on which enemy you drew. If you drew an adversary, you simply read the effect and then do whatever the card says. But if you are facing an enemy that attacks you, well then we go into battle. Each combat is fought during 3 rounds, and each round consists of 8 different steps. The first step is to see if we want to use any spells to buff up or any abilities. Once we have decided this, we go into step number 2. Where step number 2 is the attack itself. Now we need to sum up your attack value. To do that you need to add up your base attack value, but also if you have used any buffs or any equipments. Once you have that value, you take that amount of die, and then we get to roll. Each sword result you get will be a hit on your enemy. Instead of doing a normal attack, you can also choose to throw a spell instead. In that case, you will simply roll the amount of die stated on the card. In this case, 3 die. And then you hit your enemy, right? Well, no, or maybe, because the next step here is where the enemy itself actually gets to defense as well. The player on your left gets to roll the defense die for your enemies. And the amount of die that they roll to defend themselves is depending on their defense value on their enemy cards, if there's any planetary hostile effects, or if there's any effects on the square that you're standing on, well then the player to your left needs to roll that amount of die. And maybe your enemy will block out your punches. For every shield that is rolled, your enemy will block the hits. Meaning that if they manage to roll the same amount of shields as you did hits, well, nothing happens. But if they cannot block themselves and you have damaged them and lowered their life completely, they are now defeated. If you manage to take out the enemy, well, good for you, the battle's over. But if you did not manage to take out the enemy, it's the enemy's turn to attack you now. And we will do this in the same way as we did when they defended. But now the player to your left will roll to hit you instead of defending. Meaning that the player to your left will roll the attack die for the enemies, trying to get swords. And now you need to try to defend yourself instead. And you will do this just like the enemy did. You will count out the amount of defense you have and roll that amount of die. Hopefully you manage to block out the swords with the shields. If you don't, well then you take damage. And that's the way one round of combat is played out. If by the end of the first round either you or your enemy still have life left, we will go into the second round and go through the same steps one more time. By the end of the third round, if you still not have taken out your enemy, well then you will need to escape. And you will do this by moving vertically back 1 square. Or horizontally, if it's not possible for you to move vertically. But remember that every time you roll a potion during either your attack or your defense roll, you will actually regain 1 mana per skull. If you lose health points, well, you are considered to be damaged but not defeated. But if you lose all of your health points, well then you are considered to be defeated. If you become defeated in level 1, you will lose all your extra cards except your starting card. And then you will simply go back to the first square of the board. And then you can restart your mission on your next turn. But if you are on level 2 or 3 and you lose all your life, well then you are considered to be dead. Then you will lose all your cards and you will not be able to restart the mission. Unless there is a successful recovery within a few days. Because then drones will extract your body from the planet, revive you, and prepare you for a new mission. If you manage to defeat an enemy, you should save their cards. Because when you have defeated enough enemies, so their attack value adds up to 7, well then, you can discard that bounty and take and equip spell, or ally card. The fifth phase is also where you can recover, and you can choose to take a short rest. During a short rest, you can cast any spells or use any abilities to heal up. But if you want to heal up everything, meaning all of your life and all of your mana, you should take a long rest. But if you take a long rest, well then you have to step over your next turn. Now, when the first player gets to the third area and defeats the first jungle boss, the final boss will now make its appearance. So now we need to find the henchmen of the final boss in the Encounter 3 deck. But we also need to bring out the miniature on the board. Unlike the standard enemy, the final boss will move across the area with an aim of catching the invaders. Whenever a Dreamspacer ends the turn in the third area, we'll roll a die to determine how many steps the final boss will move, and then move the final boss to his closest enemy. When you and the final boss are in the same square, well then the boss fight begins. Just be aware, because you need to defeat his henchmen first, before you can start fighting the boss. But once they are gone, well then you are free to start fighting the final boss. If the final boss moves into the square on you, he will start the attack. But if you move into the square on him first, then you will start the attack. If the final boss managed to drain you on life, well then you are out of the game. And now it's up to the other players to try to defeat him. Every time the final boss defeats an enemy, he will move away from his enemies. And for each time he does this, he will regain 1 health. And if the final boss is in the same square as 2 players, he will start attacking the one with the lowest life. And if that player is dead, well then he will keep on attacking the next. The player that first managed to defeat the final boss wins the game. If the final boss managed to defeat all of you, well then you have of course lost, and you will probably need to go back and practice some more. There you have it, my friend. That was Dreamspace Mission to Marsylvania for you. This is what I would like to call a good time, old school board game. I mean, you sit down, you roll some die, you move around out on the board, you get equipment, you fight enemies, and you simply have a good time enjoying your trip into this horrible dark landscape. The game is not that hard to learn, you will get quickly into the rules, it's easy to set up, and it's quite joyful to play. You can play this with new players, you can play it with more experienced players, and simply just have a good time. If you want to know more about the game, well, there will be links down in the description, so be sure to check them out, because this will be out on Kickstarter quite soon. If you liked my video, well, be sure to put a little thumbs up, maybe put in a comment, or why not subscribe to the channel. But most importantly, my friend, please remember to keep on spreading that board gaming love I know you all have. Peace out.